So 159 line 4, so we're dealing with a propensity in folk contracts to exaggerate. Something that's called an asmachta. We reviewed last time. So an asmachta means where you put an exaggeration in just to support your intention to fulfill the contract, but you didn't really mean that particular number. I'll pay you $1 million if I break your bicycle. You just said it because you wanted to show how serious you were about not damaging the bicycle, but you didn't intend ever to pay $1 million. And it actually, there's a legal term for that, because apparently it happened a lot. We talked about how they put it in ketubas, the smachta. If you look on page 159 on the right, there's a very longer than normal, a long explanation of the concept of smachta on the right margin. Anyway, so we're going to start with an example of that, and which we did last week, but we didn't finish, and then we'll move on. So page 159, verse 4, Hahu Gavra, de Kibel Ara Mechavre. So the guy leased a field. The Kibel there is leased a field. By the way, that's the name of our chapter, right? It's about leasing fields. So we go back to after taking a detour into ketubas and marriage for a while, back to fields, leasing a field. Amarle imo varnale, yahivna le afezuze. So it says, he says in the contract itself, so this is part of the agreement they make, if I let it lie fallow, I'll give you 1,000 zuz. I mentioned last time, 1,000 zuz is a lot of money. It's like $1 million. It's an exaggerated amount. If I let it lie fallow, if he lets the land lie fallow, it's not just that the owner loses income. The owner is expecting the income, because when you lease a field, you're expecting like a third of the crop. So suddenly a third becomes zero. So that's a big loss for the owner. But also, it's bad for the field. The field is meant to be used. So, and all sorts of reasons. So anyhow, he says, if I let it lie fallow, I'll pay you 1,000 zuz. Ovir tilta, and he actually let a third of the field lie fallow when he had committed to planting and to working the whole field. And he had said, I'll give you 1,000 zuz. So Amar Nehardea, so the rabbis of Nehardea said, Dinahu, the law is, Diahiv le tlat mea utlatin utlata vitilta. So they said the law is, he gives him 333.333, 333 and a third zuz, because they didn't let the whole field lie fallow, but he let a third of it, and they just do the math. Okay, you said 1,000, you let a third of it lie fallow, you pay him the 333 and a third. The problem is, it's an asmachta. He didn't really mean to pay any of that. I mean, he intended to plow the entire field. There were circumstances, maybe beyond his control, where he couldn't. So now he's stuck, having committed to this exaggerated amount. So Rava has a different opinion. The Nahardaean rabbis feel like, doesn't matter if you were exaggerating, you have to pay a third, because that's a third of the field that you let lie fallow. Rava Amar asmachtahi. The Rava says, no, it's actually a legal concept, an asmachta. People do this. We understand this in human behavior. The asmachta lo kanya. And when it's a regularly recognized asmachta, an exaggeration, it doesn't have any legal force. That's what the lo kanya means. It wasn't an agreement. All right. We all did that. We did that last time. Okay? Now, verse 9. This is now an objection to Rava. Ula Rava. So for Rava, Maishna mehatitan. Okay, so for Rava, what about this Mishnah? What about the following Mishnah? Now, keep in mind, a Mishnah is different than a folk contract, because the Mishnah tells you the actual law. And in many ways, you have to retreat back to the law once you've got these folk contracts, because the judges have to figure out, okay, what did they agree to? But also, what is actually the law in these cases? Because sometimes they're not the same thing. I imagine we have that in American law too. Like you could agree to something in a contract that's actually not the law. So in adjudicating it, if the two parties come to a judge or a jury, they also have to figure out, well, what's the law in this case? So anyhow, so they quote the law. Imo vir, velo aved, ashalem b'meitava. So there is a law. If the lessee, person who leases the field, lets the land lie fallow, which he's not supposed to do because he's agreed to work the land, and doesn't work the land, ashalem b'meitava. He should pay the owner with the best of the produce. And we talked about this before. In a less than cash society, you often pay in produce. So what kind of apple? So I could give you a third of all the apples, but that third of all the apples might be the worst apple. So you actually, in paying the penalty for not leasing the field, in the next crop, you pay him the best of the apples. So normally under an agreement, you would pay an assortment. You would pay the medium kind of apples. All right, turn the page. So this seems to contradict Rava's earlier statement that should have to pay him anything. The whole thing is just an asmachta. It's just his agreement to work the field. Okay. Now there's a simple answer to this that Rava would answer, page 160. Hatam lo kakazim. But in the case of the Mishnah, there was no exaggeration. The Mishnah doesn't say I'll give you $1 million if I let the field lie fallow. It actually has a very reasonable penalty for letting the land lie fallow, and that's the law. So what Rava is saying is you follow the law, and the law doesn't have exaggerations in it. It actually has a reasonable amount. And therefore, Rava is actually okay with saying if we see an obvious exaggeration in the law, in the contract itself, we are free to ignore it, understanding that it's just an asmachta, it's just an exaggeration. And in any case, we can just fall back on the Mishnah, which tells us what to do. Yeah. Any questions about this? Really? No questions at all? That's funny. I find it extremely confusing. So it's either too confusing to ask questions, or I did an exceptional job explaining it. I have the feeling it's the former or not the... Yeah, you have a reasonable basis. That's why you've got the Mishnah. Well, and that's why you've got rabbis. Rabbis are supposed to know the Mishnah. So I don't care that you promised $1 million. That's not the law. Obviously, you were exaggerating when you put in $1 million. Yeah.
And as I brought up, I think last week, the definition of lying fallow, does that mean the entire thing or just a small segment?
Well, so the case itself deals with that, where it's a third. He let the third lie fallow.
Yeah, but does that mean that he let it lie fallow? How much does one need to leave lie fallow in order for this to come into effect?
I think it's the entirety. I just didn't work the field at all. You just let the field go.
Well, yes.
That's what the word means. The word means desolate. It's actually like it was total desolation. Just didn't do anything. All right. Hacha kevanda kamar milta yeterta guzma ba'alma. And he actually comes up with a rule here too. So whenever you have something additional to what the law demands as a penalty, we're going to call that guzma ba'alma. That's mere exaggeration. He's just exaggerating. When he's exaggerating, then we don't use it.
That's the basis.
Right. Okay. Number 4. Obviously, this is very complicated by this folk practice of exaggerating, and you sort of wish that they didn't do that. Just say what you mean. But that was in the culture, and we talked about last week. There are cultures today that still do that. Okay. Page 160.
They never litigated over the letter of the law, too?
They probably do. I don't know. They probably very complicated ways of dealing with this, too.
I mean, even the Mishnah law. I mean, today...
Yeah, because there's different ways of interpreting the Mishnah, so that there would still be litigations. I mean, as long as there are human beings, there's going to be litigations. And there's going to be different ways of explaining the law. So,
but it also gives them the ability to use the exaggeration and get away with it because they know that the Mishnah will support the more basic solution.
Yeah, so then, if you're entering into the contract, you have to be aware of that. Be aware that when he says $1 million, he doesn't mean it. Don't expect to collect it. If he's got a good lawyer anyway, So, I mean, because remember, these things have to come to the court. Okay. Page 160, number 4. This is an interesting case, and it's related. It's not exactly the same thing. Hahu gavra de kabel ara. So a person leases the land, lishum shemei, for sesame. Rechov Shum Shum is Sesame Street in Israel. There's a show, Rechov Shum Shum, right. Sesame Street. So Shum Shum is sesame, which is a product in Israel. So he leased the land to grow sesame. Zera achite, instead of sesame, he decides to grow wheat. So here's my question for you farmers out there. What is harder on the soil, sesame or wheat? Anybody know?
Wheat, probably.
It tells you here, yes. Okay, keep that in mind. Yeah. Did you read it? Did you read ahead? So what is it? What's the answer? I actually think it's sesame, but we'll see.
Sesame is harder to process.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, sesame is harder to process. Yeah. Okay. Now, the thing is, avda chite keshum shemei. So there's all sorts of possibilities here. So you lease to do one crop, and you end up planting another crop. Okay. Which means that you didn't follow the contract. Okay. And there's all sorts of different ways this could go. Right? Now, we start with one way it could go, which is that the amount, the financial amount, is exactly the same. So what the owner was going to get for sesame, he ends up getting for wheat. So for the owner, it's a total wash. It's a total wash, yeah. So that you can imagine that could be. So then the lessee could say to the owner, what do you care? sesame, wheat,
You got to say.
you're getting your money. And and it was easier for me. I got this deal on sesame seeds, I was able to, on wheat, and I just did wheat instead, but I'm paying you exactly the same amount. Now remember, all this would have to be estimates too, because generally it's percentage. So somehow they figure out that what the owner figures out what he expects, and the owner's getting more, exactly, in fact, what he expected. It's just from a different crop. He doesn't have to eat it. It's not like I prefer sesame to wheat. He gets the exact amount. So what do you do? Savar Rav Kahana Lememar. So Rav Kahana says, so Rav Kahana assumes this is the law. He's not actually ruling, but he's assuming this is the law. Minakele kechasha da'ara. So the owner is still allowed to deduct, in other words, to take more. But he's still allowed to deduct from the lessee the amount that the oh no, I'm sorry, I got it wrong.
The other way around.
Yeah, it's the other way around. So the lessee can deduct because what he planted actually, and this is where I was right. So it's wheat that uses up less of the field. So the lessee who planted wheat instead of sesame could say, but I'm not going to pay you the full amount because I actually saved you money because there's less degradation of the field. So I'm figuring that out also. So and that's of cash value to you. So I'm going to pay you less than that. And Rav Kahana says he can do that because the wear and tear on the field is less in the planting of wheat than sesame. Okay? And that wear and tear I'm going to deduct from the amount that I pay you. And you still end up with exactly the same amount. You get it in wheat instead of sesame, and you get it in a better field.
Enhanced value.
Right, enhanced value of your field. Right, okay. That's what Rav Kahana says. Amar le Rav Ashi le Rav Kahana. So Rav Ashi says to Rav Kahana, Amre inashe. So Rav Kahana, who actually quotes a folk saying, but in quoting the folk saying, he tells his version of the law, his interpretation, page 161. Kachasha ara velo kechiush mara. Said, okay, I'd rather that the land be degraded and not myself be degraded, not my pocket be degraded. Right. In other words, I don't care about the land right now. I need the cash. And you and I had an agreement that dealt with cash. So don't be deducting from me because you saved me wear and tear on the land. What you're doing is you're costing me wear and tear on me. I've got a family to feed. I'll worry about the land later. Really, in the broader sense, this is teaching us that if you change the contract, then the burden of proof is up to you. And don't start making deductions because he never told you to do that. I mean, if he had said to you, and we had this before when we talked about contracts, if he had said to you, you know what, if you can plant wheat, that would be better. He never said that. The contract says sesame. You're deducting because it's less wear and tear on the land, but I didn't ask you for that. And in fact, you're creating wear and tear on me, and maybe I need the cash.
But isn't the assumption here that the lessee is paying what he was supposed to pay, except that he used a different crop?
Yeah, except now he also wants to pay even less.
That's right.
Because he wants to pay even less because he's arguing what I did created less wear and tear on the field. That enhances the value of the field, so you should pay me for that. And we had this before, so the owner can easily say, look, don't do me any favors. It's not what I asked you to do. And you can't now suddenly reward yourself for violating the contract.
He's putting value on an intangible.
Yeah.
And he doesn't want.
Even if there's a tangible value.
Yeah.
Right.
But it's not something the owner is looking for at that moment. I'm not looking to sell this field. This field has sentimental value for me, so I'm not going to sell it. So the extra value to the field doesn't help me. I'm just saying that's what he could argue, and the lessee can't say anything because it's not in the contract.
Right. So you can't unilaterally change the terms of a contract.
Right. Yeah.
Is essentially.
That's the broader principle.
If you had said ahead of time, well, I decided to plant wheat, and
they agreed,
then
then
that's all right.
Yeah, so that's the broader principle. Now, it's not a hard and fast principle. There are people but in this case, it's saying, and it goes back to that broader principle. And here it also goes to this folk statement too. Like, don't assume that you know what I want. All you should be assuming is what's in the contract. You think I wanted less degradation of the field. Who told you I wanted that? Right. Maybe he had already sold the field to somebody else for a certain amount of money. So, yeah.
I thought I read where it says sesame seeds are better crop because you get more money for it.
Yeah, but in this, that could be, and we're going to have an example of that. But in this particular case, he harvested the exact same amount in value as the wheat would have been.
There was, yes.
Yeah.
It's just like in this country.
So whatever's worth,
Sometimes
right.
The crop is worth more or less, and in this particular year, the wheat
Yeah,
is worth
it
as
happened to
much
be
as
exactly the same amount that in cash that the owner would have received. Yeah.
If you don't follow the contract, you can always rationalize why.
Yeah, right.
So then
Yes,
you
right.
have to have rules, and that's
That's right.
was mentioned that
Right. You see a lot of. I mean, it's interesting. You see, the development of a society that's built on honoring contracts. Right, and which is the basis of a capitalist society. If you can't honor contracts, if there's always a way to get around contracts, capitalism isn't going to work. So free markets aren't going to work. And so you can see the rabbis, it's already in the 2nd, 3rd century, kind of always coming back to that principle, which is interesting to me. Okay, I'm going to read a little bit more.
In Babylon, what did they know about restoring depleted soil?
I have no idea what they knew, what they didn't know. No. I mean, I'm assuming they knew something about it, more than I do.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, just reading all this information about sesame over on the side, I was impressed by how much they understood about sesame.
Well, that's what Seinfeld understands anyway. So he's okay. Yeah.
But I mean, they were.
I mean, every once in a while, we come across their ideas on medical treatments, and and you shake your head, you think some of that's spot on, some of that is absurd. So my guess is probably they were a little bit better with farming, but they had their own technologies, and some of them were right, some of them were wrong, and they got it through experience.
Observation.
Experience. Yeah.
There was a
But you were
report.
dealing with an agricultural economy, and so.
So you would think exactly. That's right. Yeah.
There was a recorded Mesopotamian culture that had to move on because they depleted the soil.
Yeah. Well, they certainly knew about the soil depletion. Yeah. Okay. Page 161. Hahu gavra de kabel ara l'shumshe. Okay. It starts the same case. A person received leased the field in order to plant sesame, zera achite, and instead he planted wheat. Avda chite tfei mishum shemeh. Okay. So at this point he harvests the more wheat in the absolute value, than he would of sesame. So it's a boon for the owner. So at this point, the owner is now getting more than he would have gotten. So of course, the owner is going to clap him on the back and say, thanks, good, just keep at it. Okay, well, let's see though. Let's see. Savar Ravina lemeimar. So Ravina says, Yahiv le shvacha de bene. Okay, so he's saying actually the lessee should give less, should keep the profit for himself, and just pay what the owner was expecting to receive. So that's what's fair, because it was the lessee that made the initiative, and all the owner was expecting was a certain amount. So why should you pay him more? Okay, that's what Ravina says. Okay, the first person that talks always is wrong, because the Mishnah sets up the first person so the next person can disagree. In some ways, it's a straw horse or a sesame horse. Right? That was a very bad joke. All right. Amar le Rav Acha midifti le Ravina. Atuhu ashpach. So Ravina now says to him, now is it because of the lessee that he got greater value? Is the lessee such a talented farmer that he was able to plant wheat and get more of a value? Do we give him credit for it? Because by saying that he gets to keep the profit, we're saying he was such a brilliant farmer, so he should get to keep it. Ara lo ashpacha. Isn't it just the land? The land is a better land than they both thought. And who gets credit for the land itself? The owner. So he's saying, so therefore you should pay the owner the percentage. And also, by the way, I mean, that would be changing. It's the burden of proof on the, it doesn't say this, but it's sort of overlying the whole thing. The burden of proof is on the person that's changing the contract. So the lessee changed the contract and planted something else, and he shouldn't get the profit for that. Now they're not saying that he pays a penalty. He's just saying the owner continues to get a third of the wheat, and the owner is the one that gets the windfall, and not. By the way, I mean the lessee does get some. Yeah, they both get it, so he's sharing the windfall that way if it's a percentage arrangement. Yeah.
So let's say the market crashes.
And
wheat goes down.
Yeah, that's right.
A quarter of what it was expected to get.
Yeah.
Does the owner get a third of the original?
Yes.
Value that was expected.
Well, you could actually see from the other one. So the owner, what seems to be leading up to is that if the and we actually don't have that case right here. It exists in other places, but it would go something like this: the owner had an expectation of a certain amount of money from sesame, So as soon as the lessee changed the contract and planted wheat instead, he for sure owes him that expectation. He may give him more, but he's certainly not going to give him less. The only way he would give him less is if he actually followed the contract, and then it's a percentage, and then it's the market value and how much the land yields, and so. Okay. Page 161, number 6, Amar Nehardea. Okay, so we're getting into something complicated here, but it's quite interesting.
I just want to defend.
Oh, sorry.
Can we defend the first guy who
Yeah.
said was wrong?
Uh-huh.
So if the lessee takes the risk of switching crops, and if less crop was yielded, and therefore he had to make up to the owner,
Yeah.
then if he's taking the risk, shouldn't he get the gain?
If the market goes up.
If the market goes up, right? 'cause-
Yes, but he would have to agree to that. So he'd have to agree to that. They could agree to that ahead of time. Because
I like that to be honest. That's how to defend it.
Yeah. So okay. But what I would say is that so they can agree on what's a fair distribution of risk ahead of time, so they have that in the contract. For him just to unilaterally say I took on more risk, that's what's the issue. It's not so much yes. I mean there is a fairness in distribution of risk, and I'm holding that up right now because we're getting to that right now. You know, who holds more risk in a business arrangement, and so the idea though is there have to be rules, there has to be groundwork for it. You can't just unilaterally decide that. Okay, so here's what I want to. So Amar Nehardea Ha'iska. So the Nardeans are talking about this is a Talmudic concept called iska. It's an Aramaic word. It's based on the Hebrew word esek. Esek, what does esek mean? Business. So iska means business in Aramaic. And I'm going to, just because it's not an easy thing to explain, you would think it would be. It's not an easy thing to explain, so we have it luckily on Steinsaltz on the right-hand corner. The reason it's not so easy to explain is because there are laws about interest and lending at interest, which are in the Torah, which in the course of time, Jews managed to transcend, to overlook, or to create legal fictions, but became a complicated factor in deciding what kind of interest lenders would get who are in fact investors. So what I'd like to do is just read Steinsaltz, which I think is good, his definition of the iska in the Talmud, and where the complications come from, and if we have time we'll give an example. Okay, this is a business partnership in every sense of the word, because the two parties, the silent partner who merely invests his money and the active partner who actually manages the business, share both profit and loss. So someone's providing the capital and someone's providing the labor. Right? The labor and the ingenuity and like sweat equity, we call that, right? So okay.
That's right.
To prevent such an agreement from being used to circumvent the prohibition against lending money at interest. So that's the complication. It would be very simple to say you lend me the money to start a business and I start paying you back at 10% interest. That would be great.
Right.
And then there wouldn't be any complication at all. The complication is the Torah doesn't allow that. At least at this point, the Torah doesn't allow it. So then you have to come up with a way. And if the Torah doesn't allow it, how does a new business ever start? Because you don't have capital. So they have to come up with ways. And this evolves, of course, into something interesting. It is interesting. It's very both Christians and Jews dealt with this in different ways. They both developed advanced capitalist societies. They both had the Old Testament prohibitions against lending and interest, and they both came up with it in different ways. You know, briefly, the Christians just said, "Okay, you borrow money from Jews, and you've got right, and the Jews will lend you interest, and Jews were lending interest because it was to non-Jews.
Does the prohibition?
And then you've got the Merchant of Venice.
Prohibition give a reason why it shouldn't be done?
It's considered, yeah. Well, does it give a reason? No, but it's considered oppressive. It's an oppressive use of your capital. It's exploiting. You have all that money, and lending money is supposed to be an act of brotherhood, of generosity. It's not supposed to be an act of where you exploit somebody who doesn't have enough money. So
That's like saying you shouldn't charge for food if someone's
I
hungry.
know exactly. No,
It's not really rational.
And also it envisions very simple societies where the only reason you would ever borrow money is because you don't have money to pay for food. As soon as you get a slightly more sophisticated society where you're borrowing money to start businesses, then you have to change things. Otherwise, there won't be any businesses. So as soon as we got to that level in Judaism, they start coming up with legal fiction so they can allow lending and interest. Already in the 1st, 2nd century, we have a record of it. Probably happened before that. But in the Torah itself, you're talking about very small communities, and the only reason you would lend money is because they can't afford a coat in the winter. And then you don't want to exploit that. You don't want to say, okay, I'll lend you the money for the coat, but I'm going to make money for it. It's got to be an act of generosity.
But it doesn't make the coat dealer responsible for giving someone a coat. I sort of feel like it's unfair to pinpoint the people with the money when it's the product they want.
Yeah. Okay. So ultimately, that reasoning, that's why they overturn it. I'm just explaining the very basic point of lending money was meant to be, an act of generosity, and it can become an act of exploitation. And who are you exploiting at that point? You're exploiting the poorest segments of society. So they wanted to avoid that. It's not realistic once lending money becomes essential to a well-ordered market society.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to keep going here. Circumvent prohibition against lending money in interest, the sages decreed that the investor must accept a larger proportion of the risk than of the profit. Okay? So the investor so that's what we talked about, the fair distribution of risk. The investor who's got the money has to take more of the risk. Otherwise, he's lending at interest. He's just a lender. So this is the beginning of what happens, the redefinition of a lender. The lender is no longer a lender. The lender is an investor. So what's an investor? He has an interest. He's taking a risk in the business. So if you pay him back at a certain level of interest, he's not a money lender that's getting paid back on interest. He's an investor that has risk. So he's a partner in the business, and that's very different than being a lender. So as soon as they come to that redefinition, then they're on their way to allowing this stuff to happen. So what we're reading now is kind of a transition time in between the wholesale redefinition of lenders to investors. Okay. During the past centuries, the sages instituted heter iska. So it means recently, they're now allowing these businesses a rabbinic enactment enabling Jews to circumvent the prohibition against lending money at interest by means of a fictional partnership. Actually, in a modern economy, every loan is, from the borrower's point of view, a form of investment. Hence, the legal fiction contains an element of truth. So, of course, it's true. Any loan carries with it some risk. When you buy a loan, you buy a commercial loan from someplace, then you're also buying the risk too. Okay. So I want to turn to page 162. We'll get started on this, and then we'll continue in the next couple of weeks. So in the Talmud itself, this is how they defined an iska. An iska meaning a partnership, a business arrangement between two people, between different parties. Palga milve, half of the money. So you give me money to start a fruit stand. Let's say it's 1,000 zuz. You give me 1,000 zuz. I don't have any money at all. What I'm going to have is my expertise in planting, my expertise in marketing. I'm going to stand there, but I need your money. We're going to consider half of it a loan. And we're going to get upalga pikadon. And half of it is a deposit. Okay, now, you have to go way back. Some of you were here several years ago when we talked about what happens when I am in control of your property. And depending on how you define that property, there's different rules. For instance, if you're lending me something, you lend me your rake, I have a very high level of responsibility in returning that to you. But if you're just giving me it to keep, and I'm doing that out of the goodness of my heart, I still have a responsibility to take care of it, but it's a lesser responsibility. It's a lesser responsibility. So in the coming weeks, we'll talk about the difference in responsibility between these things. Right now, I'm just saying that you give me the money, only half of it is considered a loan. By the way, under either case, I have to pay it back. The question is, what is my obligation to pay it back, and how much of it I could use? For instance, I'll just give you one example. If I borrow your rake, what's your expectation? You lent me the rake. What's your expectation in my using the rake? I borrowed your rake. Do you feel like I'm just going to put it on my wall and display it? I'm going to use it. So as soon as I'm borrowing it, I'm going to use it. Okay? So if I'm borrowing your money to start the fruit stand, your expectation is I'm going to use that money. Now, that doesn't change the expectation that you expect the money back, but you know that I'm going to use it. Now, if you're just depositing your rake with me, like you're saying, hold on to this for safekeeping, do you expect me to use the rake?
No.
Probably not. No. And if there's wear and tear on it, then I probably owe you more for the wear and tear, because if you're lending me the rake, you assume I'm going to use it, so the wear and tear is going to be less of an issue. So you can see just in how I'm defining these words, you can see the difference. So it sounds complicated. It's not really. It will end up defining for us what the responsibility of the active business partner, we'll call it the active business partner is the one on the ground doing the business, what his responsibility will be in repaying the loan. Okay, which obviously we're redefining as half loan, half deposit. We'll call it an investment. Okay, we'll stop there.